Hello and welcome to this Economist Intelligence Unit podcast. I'm joined today by Martin Adams, EIU Energy Editor, and we're going to discuss India's energy future. That's the topic of a new report published recently by the EIU. Martin, looking at what's happened in India recently, you had massive blackouts in July this year. You've just had the Coalgate scandal that's rocked the government. Is it fair to say that energy is the issue that will prevent India from achieving superpower status?
Well, indeed, in the aftermath of those blackouts in July, there was a lot of talk about how this could interfere with India becoming a superpower. One of the newspapers put Superpower India, RIP, on its front cover. I think it's important to note that energy shortages and specifically electricity outages are nothing new in India. We see smaller blackouts on an almost daily basis. However, we do think that as energy demand increases over the course of the decade, that these shortages are going to become more severe, and they could start to impact India's economic growth in the way that, for instance, in Pakistan or Bangladesh, energy shortages have slowed down developments there.
Taking electricity first, why have the central government's plans to increase capacity and connectivity failed to achieve expectations?
Well, I think part of it can be traced to the state-owned companies that are in charge of generating and transmitting and distributing electricity, particularly those which are responsible for selling electricity to end users have great difficulty in actually recouping the cost that they pay for it or that they pay to generate it. And so many of the state electricity boards are left in a financially fairly dire state. And that, of course, means that they can't invest as they need to in some cases, generating capacity and also in the T&D, the transmission and distribution.
India has got massive reserves of coal and other natural resources, so one would expect that it would be able to achieve some measure of energy self-sufficiency. Why hasn't it been able to develop these resources, and what do you think needs to be done to rectify this?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that particularly with coal, India it has quite a resource endowment. It has the fourth largest coal reserves in the world and relies on those heavily. I mean, I think as we were discussing just now, distortions in the pricing of energy play a very big role in why India hasn't fulfilled its potential in many of these areas. Another thing is state sector involvement directly. For instance, Coal India has a reputation for being quite inefficient. And in some cases, India just simply doesn't actually have an awful lot under the ground, as with oil, for instance.
Looking at the Coalgate scandal of recent weeks, does this suggest or support the contention that the energy problems in India are basically political?
Yeah, I mean, I think at one level that's true. For instance, with electricity pricing, you see that local politicians like to use the state electricity boards as a way to sort of generate popularity, really, and by keeping electricity prices low, they can therefore make the locals happy, and that may feed through into popularity and votes for them. But that means that there are all sorts of problems that spread up the fuel supply chain because coal suppliers, such as Coal India, essentially can't sell their coal at a high enough price because electricity prices have to be kept down.
Does India have big reserves of natural gas? Is that something that can be developed? And will it run into the same problems that developing coal has had in the country?
It's a good question. It's difficult to answer in a way because we haven't seen the level of exploration that we need to get a really good idea of reserves. India's got about 1.2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which is a handy amount, and we're seeing some firms keen to explore for more. There's been talk about India having lots of shale gas, but at the moment I think geologically that's unproven. I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen more exploration so far yes, again, has to do with pricing issues, has to do with the regulation of gas prices. And also there have been bureaucratic hurdles that firms have faced. Some of the red tape has really tied them up, and it's taken a long time to get approvals to make future investments in exploration. So yes, some of those hurdles are definitely being seen.
What about renewables? Because it would seem to be obvious that a country with a rather patchy national grid is a sort of testing ground for the applicability of solar panels that don't have to be connected to a grid and can offer standalone electricity. Do you envisage a future where every household in India has its own solar panel? And if not, if it's possible for that to happen, can they be connected to the grid?
Well, I think so far as grid-connected solar is concerned, we're starting from a very low base, but some states, particularly Gujarat, have shown that they're interested in developing that. Off-grid is very interesting. Yes, as you say, it allows people in places in rural areas where the grid doesn't reach still to get electricity supplies. That said, solar power, although the cost of solar panels has fallen a lot in recent years, it's still expensive, and even with subsidies, some of them quite generous for things like rooftop solar, even with that, most people can't afford it. So I think the day when everybody has panels on their rooftop is still a long way off.
But India does have some very advanced, or it has spent a lot of time developing other renewables. Wind power in particular, I understand, actually is responsible for quite a large proportion of capacity, if not generation. What's the future for wind power? Is that going to be the renewable saviour of India's energy sector?
Well, I think, yes, we've seen wind power has grown, but as you mentioned, I mean, generation may lag capacity somewhat, and that's partly because the wind doesn't always blow. As China has seen in its rapid rollout of wind power capacity, it's not that easy to just incorporate it because it's not a consistent source of energy. The wind blows sometimes and doesn't at other times. You need quite sophisticated technology and also grid management, and it's not clear that India has got that at the moment. So that's one factor that will put a cap on how quickly wind power capacity can be rolled out in India.
Finally, can I ask you, looking ahead to the end of the EIU's forecast period in 2020, what do you see as the future of India's energy sector?
Well, coal is still going to reign supreme. India's just got too much of it, really, to transition to anything, let alone renewables, anytime soon. Oil is going to be number two, obviously driven primarily by demand from transport. We think that gas is going to grow to be somewhere around 10% of the energy mix. Nuclear and renewables are still going to be quite a small element, and by that I mean nuclear and essentially wind, solar and hydropower, accounting altogether for just a couple of percentage points of overall energy demand.
Martin, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you very much.